Velvet Note's a place where you can see and hear world-class musicians in a setting that's as intimate and as comfortable as your very own living room. What we try to do here is bring down the wall that often exists between artists and audiences. We give you a chance to get to know the artist. You're always guaranteed a chance to meet the artist. And we also want you to hear the music the way that it was meant to be heard. We have the best jazz performers in the world who perform here. Grammy winners, people who are legends in the jazz field. And all you have to do is go right down the street. Here, you're able to see them, and they're right in front of you. They're an arm's length away from you. It's like they're performing a private concert for you and the people you love. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Hi, I'm Tamara Fuller, owner of the Velvet Note. I'm about to come on stage and introduce the band for tonight, but before I do, I have a special request. We here at the Velvet Note miss you terribly, and we can't wait to see you again. And we hope that you're enjoying these broadcasts. If you are, we hope that you will consider making a contribution that will help us to continue to bring these broadcasts to you right there in your living room. You can do that by going to the Velvet Note website and hitting the donate button in the menu. You can put in your URL bar, thevelvetnote.com/donate. Or you can give us a call if you'd like. We're still answering the telephone, 855-5-VELVET. And your contribution of any level, of any sort, would be greatly appreciated. So please take that under consideration. We would love to hear from you, and we certainly hope that you're enjoying these shows. Welcome to another sold-out night at the Velvet Note! The Velvet Note's a place where you can see and hear world-class musicians in a setting that's as intimate and as comfortable as your living room. And I'm so happy to see you guys in the new year. You know, it's like it's the show with people you know in the audience. We give you a chance to get to know the musicians. We also give you a chance to hear the music the way that it was meant to be heard. The Velvet Note is a listening room. We had our acoustics designed by a protege of the Hollywood director George Lucas, under his guidance, to be the highest quality, unenhanced sound available today. And we are just rounding the curve, just 7 years out, right? 7 years down. Just a couple more months to go. Few more months to go. So, for those of you who are with us for the first time, I just want you to know that this is part of a subscriber series. We do one of these a month, and it's called Legends of Jazz, and it takes a look at the lives and the cultural and historical events and the cultural influences of the greatest artists in jazz. This is the second to the last one for this series. So it's become somewhat competitive to get into this series. I hope that you will sign up for a future series if you haven't already. And we'll show you and tell you about how to do that soon, because in the next show, we're going to release the new dates that Justin has come up with. Speaking of Justin Varnes is the leader of this series and the founder. Yeah, he deserves a woo. Give him a woo. Justin Varnes is not only our music director, but he is also a great drummer and one of the, I think, the pillars of our local jazz community. He is a teacher and a recording artist and a great band leader, and has done an enormous amount of research for not only this show, but the series in general. to fill in the blanks of what we're going to learn about and hear about tonight. Tonight we're going to focus on the music of Clark Terry and his extraordinary accomplishments and somewhat unusual twists and turns. And I'm really happy that you're here for this. He has with him a gang, so to speak. He has Nick Rosen on piano. Yeah. He has John Sanford on saxophone. And he has Grammy Award winner Ken Smith, who just recently moved to New York City on bass. Yeah, he's a New Yorker now. I know, so just so you know, he travels in for this. Yeah, yeah. So at some point, you know, you should give him a woo-woo, right? Yeah. So anyway, ready to get started? Okay, this is like taking a class, but with wine and food. Let's get it on. Put your hands together for the Justin Varnes Quartet doing the music of Clark Terry!
Guys so much. Please help me welcome Mr. John Sanford on the tenor saxophone, Nick Rosen on the piano, and Kevin Smith on the bass. So the first tune we played was entitled, is a Clark Terry original composition entitled Serenade to a Bus Seat, which is the name of the album it's from, which is from 1957. And it's a lot of fun to play, and that really kind of encompasses what Clark Terry is all about. I read his, I saw his Grammy, he won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Grammys, which we'll get into later, but they described Clark Terry as having the happiest sound in jazz, and I have to agree with that. He's put a lot of smiles on a lot of people's faces, including myself. When I was in high school, I went to my high school band went to the local college to do like a jazz festival where we played for everybody, and Clark Terry was the guest, and he was just super supportive and inviting and gave great advice, and that night he was the featured artist. He did a tune, raise your hand if you've heard the tune Mumbles before. Okay, this is your homework assignment. You must all go home and look up Clark Terry Mumbles. It is one of the most fascinating things I've ever heard in jazz, and it'll surely bring a smile to your face, as it did to a little high school kid. He sang this tune called Mumbles. He played his trumpet upside down. He somehow turned the trumpet upside down and would play with his knuckles backwards. But what was coming out was still like the baddest stuff you've ever heard. And he would play two trumpets at once. He would do all of these things to really capture your attention, but doing it on the highest level possible as a musician. And he was a big part of my taking jazz seriously and deciding to study it in college. And actually, a lot of us up here owe that to him, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But this show is particularly special for me for what Mr. Terry did for me very early on in my development. Now, Mr. Terry was born in St. Louis. He's from St. Louis, born in 1920. One of 11 kids. John's got 5, and he thinks that's too much. So, he has 3, actually. His wife, Greta, has 4, if you include him. So, that's more like it. But he was one of 11 kids, and they were, as he put it, they were extremely poor. There's just so many kids, so many mouths to feed. But he heard the Duke Ellington Orchestra and decided at a really young age that he wanted to play the trumpet. But his family could not afford to buy him a trumpet. So he said that he went down to the dump and found an old piece of pipe, and he bent it in the shape of a trumpet, and found an old a funnel, like an old metal funnel, and stuck it at the end, and took a piece of lead pipe and stuck it at the front. And he literally made his own trumpet, and would play it throughout his neighborhood. And there's one or two versions of the story. Either his neighbors saw that he was taking it very seriously, and they all pooled together money to help buy him his very first trumpet from a pawn shop. Or they got tired of hearing the racket that was coming from that device and decided, for their own sanity, to go ahead and put the money together. But anyway, so the neighborhood basically collected some money and got him his very first trumpet. And then he wanted to start learning, and he said at the time there's no jazz school, there's no books on how to learn jazz, so you just have to go out and meet the old cats on the scene and try to learn some stuff. So he would go to these guys and he would ask them advice on how to play trumpet. And he said they would just give him these really strange pieces of advice, like, all right, when you go home, if you want to be serious about this, you have to practice without your shoes. Take your shoes off, your feet have to be flat on the floor. Always play into a mirror, and if you want to get a really good sound on the trumpet, you gotta really grit your teeth as hard as you can. He said after a while he realized that they were just messing with him. They weren't telling him anything. And that actually changed the course of jazz history, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But he vowed then that that if he ever had the chance to help some kid out, he was going to tell him everything he could. So this is starting to move into the 40s now. He's starting to play trumpet around St. Louis. He's starting to meet some people and get his stuff together, practicing classical and jazz. And then he lands a gig. Well, before he lands a gig, he enlists into the Navy during World War II, where he played trumpet in one of the Navy bands for a little while. Then he got his first major gig with the Charlie Barnett Orchestra. And that only lasted about a year until Count Basie called. And then, so it was in 1948 that he got the call to play with Count Basie, which was a huge honor. And he was there for several years, 2 or 3 years. And then he got called by Duke Ellington to join Ellington's band. This was his dream ever since he wanted to play the trumpet. So it's about 1951, he's 30 years old, and he gets called by Duke Ellington to join his orchestra. So he joins the orchestra, and he's with Duke for about 10 years, and had a lot to do with a lot of the famous 1950s recordings that we all know of Duke Ellington. Live at Newport, he's on that record. Ellington Uptown, Ellington Indigos, the Three Suites, all the amazing stuff that Ellington did in the 50s, Clark Terry was a part of. And Ellington picked the Juan Tizol classic Perdido as Clark Terry's feature. And so every night Clark Terry would get featured on this tune. So much so that he and clarinetist Jimmy Hamilton wrote their own line or their own melody over Perdido that Duke adopted into the band. So we're going to do that arrangement for you right now. This is Juan Tizol's Perdido as played by Duke Ellington with Clark Terry. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to hear the melody of Perdido. As soon as that's over, Nick and John are going to play in unison the line that Clark Terry wrote, so you can get a sense of how Clark Terry played and the sounds he heard in his head. Then we're going to play for a while, and then we're going to end with kind of the famous Duke Ellington riff at the very end. So here comes Juan Tizol's Perdido. Thank you guys.
The Velvet Note's a place where you can see and hear world-class musicians in a setting that's as intimate and as comfortable as your very own living room. What we try to do here is bring down the wall that often exists between artists and audiences. We give you a chance to get to know the artist. You're always guaranteed a chance to meet the artist. And we also want you to hear the music the way that it was meant to be heard. We have the best jazz performers in the world who perform here. Grammy winners, people who are legends in the jazz field. And all you have to do is go right down the street. Here, you're able to see them and they're right in front of you. They're an arm's length away from you. It's like they're performing a private concert for you and the people you love. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Thank you guys so much. That was Kevin Smith setting us up for a great rendition of a tune that Clark Terry played tons of times over his basically 70-year career, which is a tune entitled Candy. And in musician speak, we call that a grown man's tempo for us, because there's basically, and this is something Clark Terry specialized in, because about at that tempo, there's nothing you can do, you can't hide. If you play fast enough, you can kind of throw some smoke and mirrors and some pyrotechnics and some, you know, psh, psh, psh kind of stuff and play a lot of fast notes. Like, well, I don't know what those notes were, but at least they were fast, so it must be good. But at that tempo, there's nothing you can, there's no place to hide. So that was, it's a lot of fun for us to do that, and that was one of Clark Terry's specialties. We're gonna do a couple more tempos like that for you guys in just a little bit. That version we kind of based it off of was off of his recording he did called Daylight Express from 1957. And this is while he's on the road with Duke Ellington. The first tune we played, Serenade to a Bus Seat, was also released in 1957. And so basically right around the mid-50s, Terry starts to grasp hold of his own artistic merits and wants to kind of become more of a soloist and put out his own records and kind of have his own name. So toward the end of the 1950s, Clark, as he's putting out these records, decides to leave the Ellington Orchestra and pursue some other ventures. He signed up to do a musical written by Harold Arlen and scored and arranged and filled out instrumentation-wise by one of his closest friends, Mr. Quincy Jones. So Quincy called and said, hey, I've got this little run of a musical and we want you to come do it with us. He's like, sure. Basically right at that time, or something that I guess that had been building for the last several years, is an organization called the Urban League kind of set out to go through different industries and try to figure out why some industries were just, you know, basically had yet to really allow for African Americans in their corporations, et cetera. And so one of the things they looked at the time, in the 50s and 60s, the three major stations, NBC, ABC, and CBS, all had staff musicians, and you know, like 175 musicians who would record, you know, for the Tonight Show and for commercials and any kind of music they want. They would spend hours in the studio just kind of cranking out music. You had to be on a really high level to be able to just get some sheet music you've never seen before, read it down perfectly, move on, because time is money. And what the Urban League discovered was that NBC had yet to actually none of the orchestras really had yet to integrate at that time. But they went to NBC to address it with them, and one of the NBC execs apparently said, well, but there's no black people that can read that well, so that's why we don't hire them. And they're like, interesting. We're going to take a poll, and we'll be right back with you. So they reached out. They passed out these ballots to all of these musicians and said, write down who you think is the best player in terms of sight reader, technique, you name it, the best overall player on every instrument. And Clark Terry was the only name to show up on every single ballot. That's how badass he was. As a matter of fact, one of my mentors, guy who taught at my college named Rich Madison, tells a great story about Clark. He was so good that and so busy that he would get called to do these major concerts or recording sessions or whatever it might be, but he was too busy to rehearse. He had to be over here. He didn't have time to rehearse, so he told the guys, he's like, "Don't worry about it. Like, I've got it. I don't need to rehearse. I can come in and read it." And they were like, "No. We're not paying you this much money and you not show up to rehearse." You know, I said, I tell you what, I'll cut you a deal. I'll send one of my students to the rehearsal. They'll play for me. They'll take notes. If you guys cut something, all that stuff will be written out, and I'll make you this deal. If I make a single mistake, you don't have to pay me. And they're like, "Okay, great." And according to Mr. Madison, he never lost a dime. He ran that racket for like 30 years. I've been trying to run that racket here in Atlanta, but nobody's buying it. Yeah, no bites.
Somebody's gonna sign.
So Clark got a call from NBC, and he originally got the call while they were in Paris doing this musical with Quincy Jones. But the musical was entirely in English, and they were obviously presenting it to entirely French audiences. And he said he got a telephone call from NBC one day, and he basically said, I can't, I'm doing this whole big tour over here, we're going to be here for months. And he said he went to the theater the next day, and there's a big sign that just says, "Fini." Like, nope, you guys are going home. So he said apparently all English-speaking plays don't really work well over there. So he was able to call the NBC exec back and said, "Hey, you know what? Actually, what do you say?" It's a great quote. He said, "I'll be on the first thing smoking." I'll be home on the first thing smoking. So he came home and joined the NBC. So he kind of broke the color barrier for staff musicians here in America. And it wasn't long before he ended up on The Tonight Show. And so for decades, Clark Terry's in that Tonight Show band, whether it be Johnny Carson or even a couple years before that. So he was in that band for a long time, Steve Allen, and was there for so long that he started, who did I say, Steve Allen? Jack Parr, sorry, Steve Allen's a different show. But he was there for so long that Johnny Carson started to have him come out and do features. He sang that tune Mumbles on The Tonight Show. But in the 70s and 80s, Clark was a regularly featured soloist. And when he eventually left the band, Johnny Carson had him come back occasionally. And one of Johnny Carson's favorites that he did was Clark Terry's version of a great old standard entitled "Just Squeeze Me." So we're going to do that for you right now. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, Mr. Terry had a great way with picking tunes. So many of his own compositions and tunes that he selected just put a smile on your face. He just loves to swing and make you tap your foot, and it really is infectious. If you get a chance, go home and pull up some Clark Terry on YouTube, and I promise you, the corners of your mouth will hurt after about 5 minutes. That's the kind of vibe that he was about. He had an amazing gift. Not only was he technically so proficient on the trumpet and the flugelhorn, which kind of later in his career became more of his instrument of choice. The flugelhorn is just slightly bigger than the trumpet, and it has like a warmer, darker, like mellower sound. Clark started to gravitate toward that instrument. But he had the amazing ability to combine that sound of swing music that he grew up with, Duke Ellington and Count Basie. He incorporated those elements of bebop, for those of you who've been to this series before, into that sound of bebop, the complicated melodies, as in the first song that we played, had that kind of bebop sound to it. And there's a little bit of bebop in that Perdido, that line that he wrote as well. And then later on, he developed into a modern artist as well. He recorded with McCoy Tyner, who is our next featured artist next month, by the way, McCoy Tyner. McCoy Tyner, Herbie Hancock, so many great modern, quote-unquote, jazz artists used Clark a bunch, and he was one of the few musicians who really had zero trouble playing music that sounded like it was written in the 1930s or music that sounded like it was written in the late 60s when it came to jazz. Which is one of his many, many talents. In the mid-60s, he formed a group that kind of merged all of this stuff together, and it was with a trombonist by the name of Bob Brookmeyer. And they had a quintet together for several years. It was just called the Clark Terry Bob Brookmeyer Quintet. And it's kind of if you want to go right to what is Clark Terry's sound and vision, it would be this quintet. They did a lot of really cool arrangements that have that kind of toe-tapping feeling that we like to get from early swing music, but the modern sound of some bebop and then some stuff after bebop. And most importantly, just the sound of Clark Terry's instrument, the sound of his voice is so happy and infectious. And it's a great set of music. And we're going to do a tune for you guys right now that he recorded. He recorded it a couple of times around this time, once with Oscar Peterson, and then obviously once with his own group with Bob Brookmeyer. And he and the great Ray Charles, who were also very, very good friends, both had a real affinity for this tune. This is another one of those grown tempos we're going to throw at you. It's a great tune. It's a bluesy tune. If you get a chance to check out Ray Charles singing it, please do. It's just simply entitled, "I Want a Little Girl." Thank you so much. So that was like the mid-60s. Again, a great version would be to check out Clark's as well as Ray Charles's version of that tune. Those are just great vehicles that he picked out to really strip away all the excess stuff. Sometimes we relate to jazz. It can get overly complicated. It can serve to more impress than to move. And somehow Mr. Terry was able to see through all of that, basically through his entire career, which is why I'm sure it was such a long and fruitful career, is he was able to kind of stay focused on that. So I mentioned Oscar Peterson. It was around this time, it was about 1963, 1964, that Clark connected with Oscar Peterson, and they worked together for probably 20, 30 years after that, off and on. Several recordings, lots of festival headlining and stuff like that, and that kind of really helped keep him in the spotlight. It was his direct work with Oscar Peterson from the 60s into the 70s and 80s. As he moved into the 70s and 80s, he kind of rediscovered something that he had thought to himself when he was just a little kid, which was that if he ever got to the place where he knew enough about jazz and some little kid came up to him and asked him how to play, he wasn't going to hold anything back. He was going to tell them everything that he could. And this actually started in the 50s and 60s when he was still living in St. Louis. He pulled aside a very young and impressionable trumpet player by the name of Miles Davis and worked with him and mentored him and tutored him. And it's one of the many reasons why Miles lists Clark Terry highly on his favorite trumpet players and most important influences list. Also, when he would travel, this will ring a bell for those of you who came to the show a couple months ago. When he would travel with Count Basie's group out to Seattle, he would run into a very young and impressionable trumpet player by the name of Quincy Jones. And he would pull Quincy aside along with his buddy Ray Charles, and he would mentor them and teach them little jazz licks. Hey, do you know this song? Keep working on this, etc. And Quincy said that, or I should say Clark said that Quincy was basically his first trumpet student. So every time Count Basie's band or any band would swing to over to Seattle, he'd make sure to get in touch with Quincy and teach him. So he started planting the seeds of jazz education even as far back then. But when the 70s and 80s rolled around, he started to take it a lot more seriously. He wanted to do more than just mentor the occasional young trumpet player or young musician. So he started to reach out to colleges and universities and try to help them set up jazz programs. He would, if he was on tour, he would go into a high school and do a little high school clinic. And remember all those things I was telling you about when I was in high school, to have some guy come in, just all smiles, just playing the mess out of the instrument and then turning it upside down and playing it, like all those sorts of things really helped draw so many people into this music. And it's an important time that it happens, because in the 70s and the 80s, these weren't necessarily the brightest times for jazz in terms of record sales and whatever. So he had a big hand in reviving this music, keeping this music alive by spreading the gospel of jazz education. He is the reason, he is the father of jazz education. He is probably the sole reason why so many colleges and universities have jazz programs now. And he spent the better part of the second half of his life going and playing with university big bands, and he'd be their clinician, and he'd put on a great show, and they'd raise lots of money, and he'd teach the kids, and he would do jazz festivals this way as well. As a matter of fact, he and the great bassist Milt Hinton were two of the first to start contributing musical instruments and going into neighborhoods and putting little jazz concerts on for kids in Harlem, which later became known as Jazzmobile. So Clark was really at the forefront of that as well. When I lived in New York, Jazzmobile was still going. You could still go to in the middle of the afternoon on Saturday or Sunday, you could find Jazzmobile. We would, on some flatbed truck out playing in some park. It was still going on, which is pretty incredible. which of course leads us back to myself being a young impressionable kid and really getting into this music because of him. I want before we play our last tune, I want to give you one more personal story about Clark Terry. I was in Chicago, and he was featured. He was the featured soloist for one of the local college jazz bands, and the college jazz band came out and played. They played a couple tunes, and they sounded good. And then they introduced Clark Terry, and I hadn't seen Clark Terry in a little while. When I lived in New York, I would go see Clark Terry play at the Village Vanguard all the time with his quintet, but I hadn't seen him in a while. And so they announced him, and then from the stage comes this frail old man, and he's barely walking, and he has two kids like helping him to his little chair. And he sits down in the chair. You could feel it in the room, like everybody's like, oh man, like he's not looking so hot. And he's sitting there, and he's got his little cloth, you know, trying to keep his lips dry, and he's got his little flugelhorn, his little hat on, there's a little trumpet mic right there. They start playing Take the A Train. This is going to be his feature. And they start playing it, and while the band is playing, he's just kind of sitting there like, we're so worried he's going to fall over. And at the end of Take the A Train, of the melody of A Train, there's a little break for the soloist to take. And so here comes the break. He just plays all of this incredible mess out of the trumpet like he was 20 years old. It was unbelievable. And the entire place just stood up and roared. And I could not believe this. He just out of nowhere, to the point that knowing him, I'm pretty sure he was faking it. He was just like, are they ready for this? So, man, I love that story. So, we're going to close now with one of those great tunes that Oscar and Clark Terry collaborated on. If you want to get a good sense of Clark Terry, this is a great album to purchase. It's Clark Terry and Oscar Peterson. It's called Oscar Peterson Trio +1, and Clark is the one. We're going to play the opening track off of that. They also do a version of Mumbles on this album as well. But before we do, please help me welcome these great gentlemen who've been helping me put all this music together. Mr. John Sanford on the tenor saxophone. Nick Rosen on the piano. Mr. Kevin Smith on the bass. Playing them grown-up tempos with me. Yes, my name is Justin Varnes. Thank you so much.
Justin!
Yes, sir.
You gotta play mumbles, you can't leave us holding.
Oh, no. No way. No. There's no way. No way. I will tell you this. Mumbles is so amazing. There is no way on earth I'm going to do a very poor imitation of that. So, Smitty, you want the Mumbles? You want a piece of that? Yeah.
I'm about to fire all of you.
One thing I've learned in my brief tenure of this is never give Kevin Smith the microphone. But please go home and listen to Mumbles. It is a work of art that literally only Clark Terry can pull off. You don't want to hear anybody else try it. So sorry to disappoint you, but I promise you we would get about 2 bars into this and you would go, oh, that was a terrible idea. Oh no, oh my God, make this stop. So you're welcome, I guess is what I'm really saying. But we are going to play a tune off of that same record. It's a great tune. It's very fitting for everything we've been talking about Clark Terry. It's entitled The Brotherhood of Man. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for spending your Sunday night with us. Please come back for McCoy Tyner next month, and then a whole batch of new series coming after that. Now here's the owner of the club, Miss Tamara Fuller.
Presenting the music of Clark Terry, it's the Justin Varnes Quartet. Give it up! I'd like to mention a couple of things. One is we actually have 4 of our board members here tonight. I just want to mention who they are. We've got Dr. Dana Hall over here. Dr. Lindsay Thornhill over there. Rakesh Stopper back there. And Bob Baker, who just scooted out the back door. And so to be a board member, you have to agree to teach me one thing a year. And so I just want to mention that day after tomorrow, Rakesh Stopper's time to teach me something will be coming up. We are doing something called M3, which is our marketing mastermind meeting. It's a happy hour meeting because I believe that learning takes place best over alcohol. And we bring together people in the community who have expertise in marketing or just interest, and we put them to the challenge of showing us how we can expand our customer base and do a better job at promotion. So in case you missed that in our newsletter, I just want you to know that you're cordially invited. Come and see me, and we'd be happy to include you as well. Secondly, I want to mention that we have a couple of really, really cool groovy shows coming up. One of them takes place on Valentine's Day weekend. So many of you have enjoyed the music of Roman Street. Do you know? Yeah. So this year, the Velvet Note will have a Roman Street on Valentine's Day. Now, if you're not familiar with Roman Street, this is like a flamenco guitar superfest. And it's so romantic. Well, there you go, see? But this year, this time, they're coming, they're doing something they've never done before. They're coming with a very romantic violinist. So it's the 2 Thompson brothers on flamenco guitar, plus bass and drums and violin. And it's an incredible show. The tickets go on sale at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I'm telling you, people have already been calling me saying, oh, when can I get Valentine's Day tickets? So make sure that if you're interested that you get those soon, because they're not going to last very long. And I also want to mention that we have Osnoy, Jimmy Haslip, and Dave Weckl here for a 3-night run, March 8th, 9th, and 10th. Look those names up. They are incredible in their own right, and they're performing here all together. And this is the only place in Georgia that they'll be performing this year. So we're very happy to have them. If you have always dreamt of standing in a room of musicians, that's what's going to happen, because every bassist, guitarist, and drummer in like a 100-mile radius will be here. They just can't get enough. So we're really looking forward to those shows as well. And you can find all of the rest of our upcoming shows at thevelvetnote.com. This is what we love to do, which is to bring you closer to artists who inspire you, closer to each other, and closer to the song that's in your heart. Come and see us again soon. Good night.